The date is April 14th, 1986, and the night sky over the Mediterranean Sea is a canvas of absolute darkness, stretched tight over the restless black water. Inside the reinforced concrete command bunkers of the Libyan military, situated deep beneath the sands of Tripoli and Benghazi, the atmosphere is thick with a mixture of cigarette smoke and arrogant confidence. Muammar Gaddafi, the self-proclaimed king of kings of Africa, has spent billions of dollars of his oil wealth turning his coastline into a fortress of steel and radar. His military advisors, many of them trained in the prestigious academies of the Soviet Union, they have the S-200 Vega missile system, known to NATO by the terrifying codename SA-5 Gammon, a massive long-range weapon designed to swat American strategic bombers out of the sky from nearly 200 miles away. They have the SA-2 Guideline, the SA-3 Goa, and the mobile SA-6 Gainful, creating overlapping fields of fire that cover every inch of the Libyan sky from the surface of the sea to the edge of space. They have a wall of French-made Crotal missiles for close-in defense and thousands of ZSU-23 anti-aircraft guns waiting to shred anything that gets through the missiles. To the Soviet mind, this layered defense was impenetrable. The Soviet doctrine was built on the concept of the high wall, and they believed that the sky belonged to them. But 3,000 miles away at RAF Lakenheath, in the damp fog of England, a fleet of aircraft was preparing to prove that the wall had a mouse hole, and that the Soviet understanding of physics was about to be exploited in the most violent way possible. The pilots of the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing were strapping into machines that looked like they were designed for a different war, or perhaps a different planet. They were not flying sleek, agile dogfighters like the F-15 Eagle or the F-16 Falcon. They were flying the General Dynamics F-111F Aardvark. But its most important feature, the secret weapon that terrified the Soviet strategists who knew of its existence, was hidden inside that ugly nose. It was a piece of technology that the Soviets had tried and failed to master for decades, the terrain-following radar, or TFR. The concept of the F-111 was born from a realization in the 1960s that the high-altitude skies were becoming a death trap because the shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers in his U-2 spy plane proved that Soviet missiles could reach the stratosphere. The U.S. Air Force realized that if they couldn't fly over the Soviet defenses, they had to fly under them. They needed a plane that could fly so low that it was hidden in the ground, clutter the radar reflections from trees, hills, and buildings, essentially becoming invisible to the enemy sensors. But flying low at supersonic speeds is suicide for a human pilot, because he cannot react fast enough to hills and valleys rushing at him at 700 miles per hour, meaning one blink, one sneeze, or 1 second of distraction would cause the plane to smear itself across the landscape. So the engineers at General Dynamics built a robot pilot. The TFR in the nose of the F-111 scanned the terrain ahead of the aircraft, constantly measuring the distance to the ground with millimetric precision, and it was linked directly to the autopilot. The pilot would set a clearance altitude, say 200 feet, and then take his hands off the stick, letting the plane fly itself. If a mountain appeared, the radar would see it and pull the plane up at a precise G-load to clear the peak, and as soon as the peak was cleared, the computer would push the nose down, diving into the valley to stay hidden. It was a hands-off roller coaster ride in the dark, loaded with nuclear-capable bombs. To the Soviet advisors in Libya, such a capability was theoretical at best because they knew the Americans had terrain following radar, but they didn't believe it could be used effectively over long distances in combat. They trusted their physics, knowing that radar travels in straight lines, and the Earth is curved, so if a plane flies low enough, it is below the radar horizon. But the Soviets believed that the low-altitude gap was too dangerous to exploit. They assumed the Americans would not risk crashing their expensive jets into the ground. They were wrong. The Americans were not only willing to risk it, they had built an entire doctrine around it. Operation El Dorado Canyon was the ultimate test of this doctrine. The mission was to strike Gaddafi's headquarters in Tripoli and Benghazi to punish him for a terrorist bombing in Berlin. But there was a massive political problem because France and Spain refused to let the American F-111s fly over their territory. This meant the planes couldn't take a direct route south. They had to fly around the continent of Europe through the Straits of Gibraltar and across the Mediterranean Sea, adding thousands of miles to the journey. It turned a simple strike mission into a 13-hour marathon, requiring multiple mid-air refuelings in absolute radio silence. It was the longest fighter combat mission in history at that time, a test of endurance that pushed the crews to their physical and mental limits. As the sun set, the F-111s launched from England, forming up in the darkness, with massive KC-10 extender tankers feeding them fuel like mother birds feeding their young. They flew in radio silence, communicating only with light signals. The pilots were exhausted, cramped in their cockpits alongside their weapons systems officers, fighting the monotony and the fear of mechanical failure over the cold Atlantic. But as they approached the African coast, the adrenaline kicked in because it was time to go down. The flight lead gave the signal, and the aardvarks dropped from the comfortable cruising altitude of the tankers down to the deck. They descended into the black void over the Mediterranean Sea, watching their radar altimeters unwind. 5,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 500 feet, 200 feet. At 200 feet, you are not flying, you are skimming. The salt spray from the waves was hitting the windshields. The sensation of speed was intense as the water rushed by in a blur of gray and black. In the Libyan Radar Command Center, the screens were clear. The massive P-14 Tall King early warning radars swept the horizon, their giant mesh antennas rotating rhythmically, looking for high-altitude intruders, but they saw nothing. The Soviet advisors sipped their coffee confident in the silence, not knowing that 24 tons of American aluminum and high explosives were racing towards them at Mach 0.9 just above the wave tops. The F-111s were hiding in the sea clutter, the radar reflections caused by the waves making them invisible to the Soviet radars. The plan relied on precise timing. The F-111s had to coordinate with U.S. Navy aircraft from carriers in the Mediterranean. The Navy A-7s and F-18s were the decoys tasked with suppressing the enemy defenses. At the exact moment the F-111s crossed the beach, the Navy jets would pop up and fire HARM anti-radiation missiles at the Libyan radars, designed to force the Libyans to keep their heads down or turn their radars off. As the F-111s crossed the coastline of Tripoli, the pilots engaged the TFR and the system locked on. The planes dropped even lower, hugging the contours of the Libyan landscape, roaring over sand dunes, ducking under power lines, and weaving through valleys. Inside the cockpit, it was a terrifying ride as the computerized system jerked the plane up and down violently, following the Earth's surface. The pilots had to trust the machine with their lives, because if the radar failed, or if the computer glitched, they would impact the ground in a fraction of a second. The Soviet advisors in Tripoli suddenly saw ghosts on their screens, as blips would appear for a second, as an F-111 crested a hill and then vanish again as it dove into a valley. The operators were confused, wondering if it was a glitch or a flock of birds. Before they could decide, the warnings started screaming, missile launch, as the Navy HARMs were inbound. The Libyan operators panicked. Some turned off their radars to avoid the missiles. Others fired blindly into the night, sending millions of dollars of Soviet missiles into empty space. The integrated air defense system, the pride of Soviet export technology, was disintegrating into chaos because it was designed to fight a war against high-altitude bombers, not a swarm of invisible rats racing through the streets. The F-111s were now miles from their targets. The weapons systems officers powered up their PAVTAC targeting pods, which were infrared cameras housed in a rotating turret under the belly of the plane. They peered through the darkness, looking for the heat signatures of Gaddafi's compound, the Bab al-Azizia barracks, and the military airfield. On the ground, the city of Tripoli was asleep. The streetlights were on. Cars were driving on the coastal road. The people had no idea that the hand of judgment was seconds away. The roar of the TF-30 engines was muffled by the low altitude and the speed of the approach, meaning the sound would not arrive until after the bombs. The lead F-111 call sign Remit 31 lined up on Gaddafi's personal tent. The WSO placed the crosshairs on the target and said laser on. The bomb bay doors snapped open. 4 massive 2,000-pound GBU-10 laser-guided bombs fell away. The plane leaped upward, released from the weight. The bombs rode the laser beam down, correcting their fins in flight, gliding silently toward the center of the regime. At that moment, the illusion of safety that the Soviet Union had sold to Libya evaporated. The billions of dollars spent on high-altitude missiles, the years of training, the arrogant confidence of the advisors, it was all rendered worthless by a plane that simply refused to play by their rules. The F-111 Aardvark, the ugly duckling of the U.S. Air Force, had slipped the leash and was about to deliver a wake-up call that would be heard in Moscow, proving that the most expensive wall in the world is useless if your enemy knows how to dig a tunnel under it. The explosions at the Bab al-Azizia compound were not just detonations of high explosives, they were the shattering of a geopolitical illusion, because in that split second, the sanctity of the dictator's personal fortress was violated by a weapon he never saw coming. As the 4 2,000-pound bombs smashed into the courtyard and the command tents, the shockwave rippled through the entire city of Tripoli, waking the sleeping population and sending a tremor of pure terror through the regime. But for the pilots of the F-111s, the mission had only just begun, and the easy part was over because now they had to survive the reaction. The element of surprise was gone. Every single radar operator, every single gunner, and every single missile battery commander in Libya was now fully awake and screaming for blood. The sky above Tripoli, which had been dark and silent moments before, suddenly erupted into a chaotic wall of fire that pilots describe as looking like a continuous sheet of neon rain. The Libyan gunners manning thousands of ZSU-23 and ZPU-4 anti-aircraft guns abandoned any attempt at aiming and simply filled the air with lead, hoping to create a barrier of steel that no aircraft could fly through. To the Soviet advisors watching from their bunkers, the display of firepower was impressive in its volume, but pathetic in its effectiveness, because the guns were firing at the sound of the jets, which meant they were firing at empty air where the FF-111s had been seconds ago. The Aardvarks were moving too fast and too low. They were screaming across the rooftops at 600 knots, their wings swept back, pulling hard Gs as they turned back toward the sea. The terrain, following radar, which had guided them in, now had to guide them out through an obstacle course of tracers and missiles. The threat warning receivers in the cockpits were lighting up like Christmas trees, screeching with the lock-on tones of the Soviet-made missiles. The SA-2s and SA-3s began to launch telegraph poles of fire climbing into the night sky, searching for a target. But the F-111s were operating in the clutter notch, the chaotic zone of radar reflections near the ground, where the missile guidance systems became confused. The Soviet missiles designed to kill high-flying B-52s were unable to look down and pick out the speeding bombers against the heat and noise of the city. But the most terrifying threat was the Crotale missile, a French-made system designed specifically for low-altitude defense. Several Crotales were launched, streaking towards the fleeing Americans. The pilots popped flares and chaff, turning their aircraft violently, trying to break the lock. One F-111 call sign, Karma 52, was lost during this chaotic egress, likely crashing into the sea, but the rest of the strike force punched through the wall. They pushed their throttles to the stops, engaging the afterburners. The massive TF-30 engines dumped raw fuel into the exhaust, creating 40-foot tongues of blue flame that pushed the heavy bombers past the speed of sound. They rocketed away from the coast, leaving the angry hornet's nest behind them. Back in the command bunkers, the Soviet advisors were stunned into silence. They watched their screens, which were filled with the electronic snow of American jamming and the chaotic tracks of their own missiles missing their targets. They had fired dozens of surface-to-air missiles. They had expended thousands of rounds of ammunition. And yet the American planes had flown right into the heart of their defense, dropped their bombs, and left. The impregnable fortress was a myth. The sophisticated integrated air defense system, which Moscow had touted as the best in the world, had been defeated not by a massive armada, but by a handful of planes using a tactic that exploited the one weakness the Soviets couldn't fix: the curvature of the Earth. The F-111s had flown under the radar quite literally. As the aardvarks rejoined their tankers over the Mediterranean for the long, grueling flight back to England, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the realization of what they had achieved. They had conducted the longest fighter combat mission in history, round trip of nearly 6,000 miles. But the damage they left behind was not just physical, it was psychological. When the sun rose over Tripoli, the extent of the humiliation became clear. The bombs had hit the Azizaya barracks, the Sidi Bilal terrorist training camp, and the Tripoli military airport. On the tarmac at the airport, the burning wreckage of Soviet-supplied Il-76 transport planes lay smoking. These massive lifters, vital for Gaddafi's logistical support, had been destroyed on the ground. Even worse, several MiG-23 Flogger fighters, the frontline interceptors of the Libyan Air Force, had been smashed inside their hardened shelters. They never even had a chance to take off. The Soviet engineers who built those shelters had guaranteed they were bomb-proof, but they hadn't counted on the precision of a laser-guided weapon delivered from point-blank range. The raid also revealed the terrifying fragility of the Soviet client-state model. Libya had all the hardware money could buy, but they lacked the software, the training, the discipline, and the flexibility to use it. The Soviet advisors had trained the Libyans to fight a static, scripted war. The Americans had fought a dynamic, fluid war. The disconnect was fatal. Diplomatic cables sent from the Soviet embassy in Tripoli to Moscow the next morning were filled with excuses and finger-pointing. They blamed the Libyan crews for being incompetent. They blamed the French for selling Libya the wrong radar frequencies. But deep down in the halls of the Kremlin, the generals knew the truth. Their technology had failed. The P-14 Tall King radars had failed to detect the low-level approach. The SA-5 Gammon missiles, the pride of the Soviet strategic defense, had failed to score a single hit. The entire philosophy of the Red Army's air defense, which relied on heavy centralized control and high-altitude interception, had been exposed as obsolete. The raid on Libya was a dress rehearsal for a war in Europe, and the results suggested that if NATO attacked the Soviet Union, the Red Army would be blind, deaf, and dumb within the first hour. This realization sent shockwaves through the Warsaw Pact. It forced a massive and expensive rethinking of their entire defensive strategy. They realized they needed new radars capable of looking down. They needed new missiles that could maneuver faster. They needed to spend billions of rubles they didn't have to plug the hole that the F-111 had just flown through. The F-111 Aardvark, the plane that the press had mocked and the Congress had tried to cancel, had vindicated itself in a single night. It proved that in the age of electronic warfare and precision munitions, speed and altitude were less important than stealth and terrain masking. The ugly duckling had become a dragon. For Muammar Gaddafi, the raid was a personal trauma from which he never fully recovered. He had been sleeping in his tent when the bombs hit, and he escaped with his life by mere seconds. The psychological impact of knowing that the Americans could reach out and touch him in his bed, despite his billions of dollars of defenses, terrified him. He went underground, both literally and metaphorically. The volume of Libyan-sponsored terrorism dropped significantly in the years that followed. The mad dog of the Middle East, as Reagan called him, had been muzzled not by an invasion, but by a surgical strike delivered by the silent service of the night. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, suffered a massive loss of prestige. Their allies began to doubt the value of the Soviet security umbrella. If Moscow couldn't protect its closest African ally from a humiliating slap in the face, what chance did they have of protecting anyone else? The raid on Libya was one of the cracks in the foundation of the Soviet Empire, a demonstration of Western technological superiority that contributed to the crisis of confidence that would eventually bring the whole system crashing down. As the exhausted crews of the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing landed back at Lakenheath 14 hours after they took off, they were greeted as heroes, but they were also silent professionals who knew that they had just rewritten the textbooks of aerial warfare. They had proven that the Earth itself could be used as a weapon, a shield to hide behind, while delivering the sword. And they had left the Soviet generals staring at their blank radar screens, wondering how a machine made of aluminum and wires could defeat a system made of steel and ideology. The aftermath of the El Dorado Canyon raid was felt far beyond the smoking ruins of Tripoli, because it sent a seismic shockwave through the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. For the Soviet Union, the sight of their most advanced export weaponry reduced to scrap metal by a strike force that had flown thousands of miles was a public relations disaster of the highest order. The diplomatic cables flying between Tripoli and Moscow were filled with recriminations and panic as the Libyan generals demanded to know why the expensive radars they had purchased failed to detect the American bombers until the bombs were already falling. The Soviet technicians on the ground scrambled to find excuses, blaming the curvature of the Earth and the incompetence of the Libyan operators, but privately they sent reports back to the Kremlin that were deeply unsettling. They admitted that the American terrain-following technology and precision targeting capabilities were years ahead of anything the Soviet defense industry could counter. The psychological impact on Muammar Gaddafi was profound and immediate, because the man who had styled himself as the revolutionary leader of the Arab world and a thorn in the side of the West suddenly went silent. For years after the raid, Gaddafi lived in a state of paranoia, moving from tent to tent, fearing that the silent gray shapes would return in the night to finish the job. The volume of Libyan-sponsored terrorism dropped significantly, and the rogue state was effectively neutralized not by a full-scale invasion, but by a single surgical blow delivered with absolute precision. The F-111 had proven that air power could be a strategic scalpel, capable of altering the behavior of a nation without the need for a messy ground war. But the story of the Aardvark did not end in Libya, because 5 years later, the ugly beast would be called upon again to dismantle another Soviet client state, this time on a much larger scale. When Operation Desert Storm began in 1991, the F-111s were deployed to Saudi Arabia and Turkey, forming a critical part of the coalition air campaign. By this time, the Air Force had newer toys like the F-15E Strike Eagle and the F-117 Nighthawk, but the F-111 proved that it was still the heavyweight champion of interdiction. During the war, the F-111Fs introduced a new terrifying tactic known as tank plinking, which fundamentally changed how armor was destroyed from the air. While the A-10 Warthogs were chewing up columns in the daylight, the F-111s owned the night. Using their pave-tack infrared targeting pods, the weapons systems officers discovered that Iraqi tanks buried in the sand retained the heat of the desert sun longer than the surrounding cold sand. Through the thermal camera, the tanks glowed like white-hot bricks in the darkness. The F-111s would cruise high above the range of the Iraqi anti-aircraft guns and drop GBU-12 laser-guided bombs directly onto the turrets of the Dug in T-72s. It was a shooting gallery. The Iraqi tank crews who believed they were safe under the cover of darkness and sand found themselves being picked off one by an enemy they could not see or hear. The F-111s destroyed over 1,500 Iraqi armored vehicles during the conflict, a score that rivaled the A-10, proving that the old Aardvark was not just a bomber, but the most lethal tank killer in the inventory. The Soviet advisors watching the destruction of Saddam's army saw yet another layer of their military doctrine peeled away because they had believed that camouflage and digging in would protect their forces. But the F-111 proved that there is no place to hide from a thermal sensor linked to a laser-guided bomb. The aircraft that had been ridiculed in the 1960s as a failure had matured into the most effective strike platform of its generation. However, time is the one enemy that no aircraft can defeat, and by the mid-1990s, the F-111 fleet was aging. The variable geometry swing wings which gave the plane its incredible performance were a maintenance nightmare requiring thousands of man-hours to keep operational. The Air Force began to retire the F-111, replacing it with the F-15E Strike Eagle, which was easier to maintain and could fight its way out of a dogfight if necessary. The retirement ceremony at Cannon Air Force Base in 1996 was a somber affair, as the pilots who had flown the Aardvark through the valleys of Vietnam, the canyons of Libya, and the deserts of Iraq said goodbye to a machine that had brought them home when nothing else could. But the Aardvark had one final act to play on the world stage, because the Royal Australian Air Force continued to operate the F-111 long after the Americans retired it. The Australians loved the pig, as they affectionately called it, because its long range and high speed were perfect for defending the vast continent. It became an icon of Australian air power, famous for its unique ability to perform the dump and burn maneuver, where the pilot would dump fuel from the rear vent and ignite it with the afterburners, creating a massive trail of fire behind the aircraft like a dragon. This spectacular display was a crowd favorite at air shows, but it was also a reminder of the raw power contained within the airframe. When the Australians finally retired their F-111s in 2010, it marked the end of an era. The swing-wing design, once seen as the future of aviation, had largely been abandoned in favor of stealth and electronic warfare. But the legacy of the F-111 remains embedded in the DNA of modern air combat. The terrain-following radar technology it pioneered paved the way for the cruise missiles that fly down city streets today. The precision bombing tactics it perfected in Libya and Iraq became the standard for all future air campaigns, and the lesson it taught the Soviet Union was one of the most painful of the Cold War, that building a wall of radar is useless if your enemy can simply crawl under it. The F-111 Aardvark was a paradox, a plane that was too advanced for its time when it was born, and too capable to be retired when it was old. It was ugly, complex, and loud, but it was also effective, terrifying, and unstoppable. As the last F-111 sits in a museum today, silent and cold, it stands as a monument to the engineers who dared to dream that a plane could fly fast and low at the same time, and to the pilots who trusted a computer with their lives in the pitch-black darkness of a Libyan night, proving that the most dangerous place in the sky is right down in the weeds. The Soviet generals who laughed at the aardvark are gone and their empire has turned to dust, but the memory of the night the sky fell on Tripoli remains a testament to the enduring power of American innovation and the sheer audacity of the men who flew the pig.